A man stood in the howling dark, holding a dying child he couldn't save. Caleb Ward had buried his wife 3 weeks ago in frozen ground. Now her newborn daughter was starving to death in his arms, and he had no answers left. The baby's cries had faded to whispers. The storm outside matched the one tearing through his chest. He was a rancher who'd survived drought, debt, and loss. But this? This was different. This was watching hope die by inches. What happened next would either destroy him completely or save them both in the most unexpected way. If you want to see how this story ends, stay until the final word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind had teeth that night. It tore across the Wyoming plains like something alive and hungry, battering the small cabin until the walls groaned and the windows rattled in their frames. Inside, Caleb Ward walked the same 4 steps he'd been walking for hours, from the fireplace to the cradle and back again, cradle to fireplace, an endless loop that solved nothing and changed nothing but kept his legs moving when everything else in him wanted to collapse. In his arms, wrapped in blankets that had once smelled like his wife, the baby made sounds that weren't quite cries anymore, more like hiccups, little gasps, the kind of noises that meant a body was running out of strength to protest its own suffering. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since he'd lowered Sarah into the ground. 3 weeks since he had stood in the cemetery outside Bitter Creek with his hat in his hands and his world in pieces, listening to words that meant nothing while the November cold bit through his coat. The preacher had talked about heaven and mercy and plans beyond human understanding. Caleb had nodded because that's what you did. But he hadn't heard a damn word of it. All he'd heard was the wind. The same wind that was trying to tear his cabin apart right now. Sarah had died the way she'd lived, quietly, without complaint, slipping away in the night while Caleb slept beside her. The birth had been hard. Too hard. The midwife had warned them, had said Sarah was bleeding too much, that her body wasn't recovering the way it should. But Sarah had smiled through her exhaustion, had held their daughter with trembling arms and said she just needed rest. Just a little rest, and she'd be fine. She'd lied. Or maybe she'd believed it. Caleb would never know. He'd woken to cold sheets and a silence so complete it had stopped his heart. For a moment, one terrible, crystalline moment, he'd thought she was just sleeping deeply. That if he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't disturb the stillness, she might stay that way forever. Peaceful. Present. Then the baby had cried, and reality had crashed back in. The funeral was small. Most of the town came. Bitter Creek wasn't big enough for privacy, and Sarah had been liked well enough. The women brought food. The men shook his hand and said they were sorry for his loss, their faces uncomfortable with grief they didn't know how to carry for someone else. Caleb had accepted their condolences with the numb politeness of a man going through motions, his daughter wrapped in blankets and passed between sympathetic arms while he stood beside a hole in the frozen earth. Nobody had asked if he needed help. Maybe they assumed he'd figure it out. He was Caleb Ward, after all, a rancher born and raised, a man who'd weathered his father's death and his mother's departure, who'd built a life from nothing but stubbornness and early mornings. If anyone could raise a child alone, it'd be him. They were wrong. The first night after the funeral, Caleb had tried to feed his daughter with a bottle and goat's milk the way the midwife suggested. The baby had screamed, not cried, screamed, a sound so raw and desperate it had made his hand shake. She'd turned her head away from the bottle, refused it with the kind of primal stubbornness that told him this wasn't just preference. This was rejection. He'd tried again and again. Different bottles, different temperatures, milk from the goat and milk from the cow, and even sugar water when nothing else worked. She'd taken a little sometimes, enough to wet her lips, maybe an ounce if he was patient, but never enough, never close to enough. By the second day, she was crying constantly. By the fourth, the crying had turned hoarse. By the end of the first week, Caleb had stopped sleeping entirely. He'd walk her through the night, bouncing her gently, singing songs his mother had sung to him when he was small, his voice cracking on words he'd half forgotten. Nothing helped. She was starving, and he couldn't stop it. The midwife came by after 10 days. Mrs. Brennan was a stout woman with capable hands and a face that had seen enough suffering to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. She'd examined the baby with professional efficiency. her expression growing darker with each passing moment. "She's not getting enough," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice flat. Not unkind, just factual. "You can see it in her color, in how she moves." "I'm trying everything," Caleb said. He heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "She won't take the bottle. Or she takes a little, and then some babies are like that," Mrs. said. Brennan handed the infant back to him with the careful gentleness of someone returning something fragile. "Their bodies know what they need, and what they need, you can't give them." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. "What am I supposed to do?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. There was pity in her eyes, but also resignation. The look of someone who'd delivered too many babies into too much hardship, who knew how often the world didn't bend to accommodate what should be simple. "Find a wet nurse," she said finally. "It's the only way." "Where?" "I don't know." She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "Nearest I know of is in Casper, maybe Sheridan. But with winter coming on..." She trailed off. They both knew what she meant. The roads would be impassable soon. The snow was already falling harder each night. Even if he could make the journey, it would take days. Days his daughter didn't have. Mrs. Brennan left, and Caleb stood in the doorway watching her wagon disappear into the gray afternoon. The baby was quiet in his arms, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of a small body too tired to protest anymore. That's when the fear really set in. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a crisis that he could handle. He was used to emergencies, to cattle breaking through fences or storms coming up fast, or injuries that needed quick thinking. This was different. This was the slow, creeping fear of inevitability, the kind that whispered in the back of his mind that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough. That he was watching his daughter die in slow motion, and all his strength and experience and determination meant nothing against the simple fact that she needed something he couldn't provide. The days blurred together after that. He tried everything Mrs. Brennan had suggested, and things she hadn't. He mashed potatoes fine enough to mix with milk. He tried honey water. He even killed one of his chickens and made broth so thin it was barely more than warm liquid, hoping she'd take it from a spoon. She didn't. Each day she grew lighter in his arms. Her cries grew weaker. Her eyes, Sarah's eyes, the same deep brown that had made him fall in love 11 years ago, started to look hollow. He stopped going into town. Stopped checking on the cattle except for the bare minimum to keep them alive. The ranch, the life he'd built. None of it mattered if he couldn't keep this one small person breathing. So he stayed in the cabin, walking his endless loop, trying to will his daughter to live through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept the alternative. But will wasn't enough. By the time the storm hit, the real storm, the one that turned the world into a wall of white, Caleb had been awake for so long he'd started seeing shadows move in corners where nothing stood. His hand shook when he tried to stoke the fire. His thoughts moved like molasses, slow and thick and disconnected. The baby had stopped crying entirely. She just lay in his arms, her breath coming in small, irregular gasps. Her lips had a bluish tint. When he touched her cheek, her skin felt papery and cool. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. He'd survived his father's death from a fall off a spooked horse. He'd survived his mother leaving when he was 15, walking out in the middle of winter with nothing but a carpet bag and a note that said she was sorry, but she couldn't do it anymore. He'd survived drought and debt and the slow, grinding loneliness of building a life on land that didn't care whether he lived or died. But he wasn't going to survive this. The wind screamed outside, shaking the cabin so hard that dust sifted down from the rafters. The fire was burning low. He should add wood, should keep the heat going, but he couldn't make himself move. He just stood there, holding his daughter, watching her breathe, counting each small rise and fall of her chest, and wondering which one would be the last. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice was raw. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I don't know what else to do." She didn't respond, didn't even open her eyes. Caleb felt something break inside him then, something he hadn't known was still intact. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. A simple acknowledgement that he'd failed, that all his strength and stubbornness hadn't been enough, that sometimes, no matter how hard you fought, you still lost. He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd smiled at him on their wedding day, nervous and radiant in a dress her sister had sewn, about the way she'd laughed when he'd tried to dance at their reception and nearly tripped over his own feet, about the way she'd held his hand during the bad years when the cattle were dying, and the bank was circling and everything felt like it was crumbling, and she'd said, "We'll figure it out, we always do." Except this time, they wouldn't. He carried his daughter to the rocking chair by the fire and sat down, cradling her against his chest. If this was going to be it, if this was the end, he wasn't going to let her die alone in the cradle. He'd hold her, he'd keep her warm, and when it was over, when her small heart finally stopped, he didn't know what he'd do. The fire popped, sending up a spray of sparks. Outside, the wind howled like something wounded. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to remember a prayer his mother had taught him when he was small, before she'd gotten hard and distant and angry at the life she'd chosen. But the words wouldn't come. There was nothing in his head but exhaustion and grief and the terrible, crushing weight of failing the one person who'd depended on him completely. Time passed. He didn't know how much. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. Then, a sound. At first he thought he'd imagined it. A trick of the wind, maybe, or his exhausted mind creating phantom noises. But it came again, clearer this time. A knock. 3 sharp raps against the cabin door. Caleb's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, more insistent now, and he heard something else beneath it. A voice, muffled by the storm but unmistakably human. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." A woman's voice. Caleb stood on legs that threatened to buckle, his daughter still cradled against his chest. He crossed the cabin in 4 unsteady steps and yanked the door open. The wind nearly tore it from his hands. Standing on his porch, lit by the weak glow spilling from the cabin, was a woman he'd never seen before. She was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes heavy with snow and ice. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm sorry to intrude. I got lost in the storm, and I saw your light, and I—" She broke off, her gaze dropping to the bundle in his arms. To the baby. "Oh," she whispered. Caleb should have said something, should have invited her in or asked her name or done any of the normal things a person does when a stranger shows up on their doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, but he just stood there, too tired and too broken to form words. The woman took a step forward, and the light fell fully across her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with a pale complexion and dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd been traveling hard. But it was her expression that caught him. The way she was looking at his daughter, not with polite concern, with recognition. "Your baby," she said quietly. She's hungry, isn't she?" Something about the way she said it, the certainty, the understanding, made Caleb's throat tighten. "I can't feed her," he said. The words came out flat, defeated. "Her mother died. I've tried everything, but she can't." The woman stepped fully onto the porch, close enough now that he could see she was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears cutting tracks through the dirt and snow on her cheeks. "I can help," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "I can help." She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes, grief and hope and desperate need, all tangled together. "I lost my baby 4 months ago, but my body, it's still." She stopped, her voice breaking. Then she steadied herself and said very clearly, "I can nurse her, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Caleb just stared at her. The storm roared around them, and the baby made a small, weak sound against his chest, and the stranger stood there shaking and crying and offering him something impossible, something that felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. "Come inside," he said finally. The woman stumbled past him into the cabin, bringing a gust of wind and snow with her. Caleb pushed the door shut and bolted it, then turned to find her standing by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, water dripping from her clothes onto the worn wooden floor. She looked around the cabin, taking in the cradle by the fire, The dishes piled in the dry sink, the general chaos of a man trying and failing to hold his life together. And then her gaze came back to the baby. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hands. Caleb hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him that this was wrong, that you didn't just hand your child to a stranger who'd appeared out of a storm like something from a ghost story. But he looked down at his daughter, at her bluish lips and shallow breathing, and he knew he was out of options. Slowly, carefully, he placed the baby in the woman's arms. She held the infant like she'd been made for it, with a natural grace that made Caleb's own clumsy attempts look like what they were, the desperate fumbling of someone learning a skill with no teacher and no time. The woman looked down at the baby, and her whole face softened. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I've got you now." Then, without ceremony or explanation, she sat down in the rocking chair, adjusted her wet coat, and began to nurse. The baby latched immediately. Caleb heard the small, desperate sounds of his daughter drinking, and something inside him shattered completely. His knees went weak. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep himself upright, and he watched, unable to look away, as his child fed for the first time in days. Really fed, not the reluctant sips from a bottle, but deep, hungry pulls that said her body knew exactly what it needed. Minutes passed. The wind battered the cabin. The fire crackled low. And the stranger rocked slowly in the chair, humming something soft and wordless, while Caleb's daughter drank and drank like she was trying to make up for every hungry hour she'd endured. Finally, the baby's eyes fluttered closed. Her body relaxed. She fell asleep still nursing, her small mouth slack and satisfied. The woman looked up at Caleb. She was still crying, but there was something else in her expression now. Relief, maybe, or purpose. "She's going to be okay," the woman said quietly. Caleb couldn't speak. If he tried, he'd fall apart completely. So he just nodded. The woman smiled, a small, sad thing, and looked back down at the sleeping baby. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Eliza Moore. Caleb Ward." His voice was barely a whisper. "And I don't even know what to call her. We hadn't settled on a name before." He trailed off. Eliza nodded, understanding without him having to finish. "She's beautiful," she said simply. They sat in silence after that, the storm raging outside while inside, for the first time in weeks, there was peace. The baby slept. Eliza rocked. And Caleb stood by the table, watching them both, trying to process what had just happened. A stranger had appeared in the middle of a blizzard. A woman who'd lost her own child. A woman whose body still carried the evidence of that loss. The milk that had nowhere to go. The maternal instinct with no outlet. And she'd saved his daughter's life. After a while, Eliza carefully shifted the baby, cradling her in one arm while adjusting her clothing with the other. "She'll be hungry again soon," she said. "Babies this young need to eat every few hours. If you want, I can stay until the storm passes. Make sure she's fed properly." Caleb realized, dimly, that he should probably ask questions. Where had Eliza come from? Where was she going? What was she doing alone in a Wyoming blizzard in the middle of winter? But he was too tired, and frankly, he didn't care. She'd done what he couldn't. That was enough. "The spare room's through there," he said, nodding toward the door on the far wall. "It's not much, but the bed's clean. You should rest." Eliza looked surprised, like she'd expected him to turn her away as soon as the immediate crisis passed. "Are you sure?" "You saved her life," Caleb said. It was the simplest truth he knew. "Stay as long as you need." Something shifted in Eliza's expression. Gratitude mixed with relief, mixed with something deeper that Caleb couldn't quite name. She nodded, then stood carefully, still cradling the sleeping baby. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just gestured toward the spare room. Eliza walked past him, moving with the slow, exhausted grace of someone who'd been traveling for far too long. She paused in the doorway and looked back. "She really is beautiful," Eliza said again. "What's her last name?" "Ward, like mine." "And her first?" Caleb looked at the tiny, sleeping face visible in the blankets. Sarah had wanted to name her after her grandmother. "Elizabeth," she'd said. "A good, strong name." But standing here now, looking at the woman who'd appeared out of nowhere to save his daughter's life, another name came to mind. I don't know yet, he said quietly. I'll figure it out. Eliza nodded and disappeared into the spare room, taking the baby with her. The door closed with a soft click. Caleb stood alone in the main room, the fire burning low, the storm still screaming outside. He should add wood to the fire. Should eat something. He couldn't remember when he'd last had a real meal. Should try to sleep, though he doubted his body remembered how. Instead, he sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. For 3 weeks, he'd been drowning. For 3 weeks, he'd watched his daughter slip away despite everything he'd tried, every prayer he'd whispered, every desperate attempt to keep her alive. He'd been ready to give up, had been standing on the edge of total collapse. And then a stranger had knocked on his door. He didn't believe in divine intervention, didn't believe in miracles or fate, or the idea that things happen for a reason. The world was too random, too cruel for that kind of thinking. Sarah had died for no reason. Babies starved for no reason. Good people suffered while bad people prospered, and trying to find meaning in chaos was a fool's errand. But tonight he couldn't help but wonder. Outside, the wind began to die down. Not completely, but enough that the cabin stopped shaking, enough that the howling became a whisper. Caleb lifted his head and looked toward the spare room. Behind that door, his daughter was sleeping, safe, fed, alive. Because a woman he'd never met had appeared out of a storm at the exact moment he needed her most. He didn't have words for what he felt. Gratitude seemed too small. Relief didn't cover it. There was something bigger happening here, something he didn't understand and probably never would. All he knew was that his daughter was breathing. And for tonight, that was enough. The fire popped, sending up another spray of sparks. Caleb watched them rise and fade, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he let himself feel something other than fear. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, barely there, but hope nonetheless. He stood, added wood to the fire, and then walked to the spare room door. He didn't open it, just pressed his palm flat against the wood and listened. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of breathing. 2 rhythms, overlapping, the baby and Eliza, both asleep. "Thank you," he whispered. He didn't know if he was talking to Eliza or to whoever had sent her. Maybe both. Maybe neither. It didn't matter. He went to his own room, lay down on the bed he'd shared with Sarah, and closed his eyes. Outside, the storm finally broke. The snow stopped falling. The wind faded to nothing, and inside the cabin, for the first time since Sarah died, there was peace. Caleb slept. When he woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the window. He lay still for a moment, disoriented, his body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. Then memory returned. The storm, the stranger, his daughter finally feeding, and he sat up fast. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. He was out of bed and moving before his mind fully caught up, crossing the main room in 3 strides and pushing open the spare room door without knocking. Eliza sat in the chair by the window, the baby in her arms, both of them bathed in pale morning light. She looked up when he entered, startled, and he saw she'd been crying. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I was just feeding her, and I—" She stopped, her voice catching. Caleb looked at his daughter. Her color was better, her breathing steady. She was awake and alert, her small hand curled around Eliza's finger. "She's okay?" he asked. "She's perfect." Eliza's smile was watery but genuine. "She ate twice during the night. Good long feedings. She's strong, this one." Relief hit Caleb so hard his knees nearly buckled. He grabbed the door frame for support and just breathed for a moment, letting the reality sink in. His daughter was okay. She was going to survive. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Eliza looked down at the baby. "I should thank you," she said quietly. "Last night, when I knocked on your door, I wasn't sure you'd let me in, and if you hadn't, I don't think I would have made it through the storm." "Where were you coming from?" Eliza's expression closed off, just slightly. "East. I've been traveling for a while." "Alone?" "Yes." There was clearly more to the story, but Caleb didn't push. Whatever had brought Eliza Moore to his door in the middle of a blizzard was her business. All that mattered was that she was here. "Stay," he said suddenly. The word surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "At least until she's strong enough until she's stable. I can pay you, not much, but I've got some money saved, and—" "No." Eliza cut him off, her voice firm. "I don't want your money." "Then what?" She looked at him, and there was something raw in her eyes, something that spoke of grief so deep it had bones. "Just let me help her," she said. "That's all I need." Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't understand, not really, but he recognized pain when he saw it. Eliza Moore was running from something, or maybe toward something, and his daughter had become part of that journey. He could accept that. As long as his little girl kept breathing, he could accept anything. "All right," he said. "Then stay." Eliza's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you." Caleb left her there and went to start breakfast. The morning routine was familiar. Building up the fire, putting coffee on to boil, frying eggs and salt pork in the cast-iron skillet. Normal tasks that felt almost surreal after weeks of chaos. When Eliza emerged from the spare room a while later, she'd changed out of her wet clothes into a simple brown dress she must have had in her traveling bag. Her hair was still damp but combed, pulled back in a neat braid. She looked younger in the daylight, and so tired that Caleb wondered when she'd last slept properly. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. She did, accepting a plate with quiet gratitude. They ate in silence, the baby sleeping in a makeshift bed Caleb had fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. "What's her name?" Eliza asked eventually. Caleb looked at his daughter. He'd been thinking about it all morning. Sarah had wanted Elizabeth, but watching Eliza hold his child, watching the tenderness and care she showed, he found himself thinking of something else. "Emma," he said. It had been his grandmother's name. A strong woman who'd crossed the plains in a wagon and built a life in territory that didn't want her. It felt right. "Emma Rose Ward." Eliza smiled. "That's beautiful." They finished breakfast, and Caleb showed Eliza where things were. The well out back, the root cellar, the barn where he kept the livestock. The day passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Eliza fed Emma every few hours, and between feedings she helped with small tasks around the cabin. She didn't talk much, but her presence filled spaces that had been empty too long. That evening, after Emma had been fed and put down in her cradle, Caleb and Eliza sat by the fire. Outside, the world was buried in snow, 3 feet at least, drifted higher against the buildings. "It'll be a while before the roads are passable," Caleb said, staring into the flames. "I know. You're welcome to stay, for as long as it takes." Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Your wife, when did she—" 3 weeks ago. The words still felt impossible. "The birth went hard. She lost too much blood, and by the time we realized how bad it was—" He trailed off. Some stories didn't need endings spelled out. "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "You said you lost a baby." Eliza was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Her name was Grace. She was born too early, lived 3 days." She pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. "I still feel her sometimes, like she's still with me." "Where's her father?" Eliza's face hardened. "Gone. He left before she was born. Said he couldn't handle the responsibility." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turned out he was right. He couldn't. They sat in silence after that. 2 people bound by loss, by grief, by the strange mercy of survival. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it wasn't the violent storm of the night before. Just the normal winter cold, the kind you learn to live with. And inside, Emma slept peacefully, her belly full, her breathing steady. The beginning of something new. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Eliza woke before dawn, as she had every morning of her adult life, and fed Emma in the dim light before the sun broke over the eastern ridge. Caleb would hear them through the thin walls, the soft sounds of the baby nursing, Eliza's low humming, the creak of the rocking chair, and he'd lie there for a moment before rising, letting himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. By the time he emerged from his room, Eliza would have coffee made, and Emma settled back in her cradle, and they'd move through the morning tasks with the efficiency of people who understood that survival required routine. He'd tend the livestock while she tidied the cabin. She'd prepare meals while he chopped wood. They worked around each other like dancers learning a new step, awkward at first, then gradually finding a shared pace. They didn't talk much those first few days. There didn't seem to be much to say that hadn't already been said, or maybe they were both too raw to risk saying more. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd both learned that sometimes words just got in the way of healing. Emma grew stronger. Her color deepened to a healthy pink. Her cries became vigorous instead of weak, and she started staying awake for longer periods, her dark eyes tracking movement across the room with the focused intensity of the very young. Every time Caleb looked at her, he felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, mixed with gratitude, mixed with a fierce, protective love that surprised him with its intensity. On the fifth morning, he woke to find Eliza in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands, working dough on the counter with practiced efficiency. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up, startled. "Do what?" "Bake, cook, any of it. You're already—" He gestured helplessly toward Emma, trying to find words for something that felt too big for language. "You've already done more than I could ever repay." Eliza's expression softened. "I need to keep busy," she said quietly. "If I stop moving, I start thinking, and if I start thinking—" She trailed off, but Caleb understood. He knew all about the kind of thoughts that came in stillness, the memories that waited in quiet moments to drag you under. "All right," he said, "but at least let me help." So they worked together, Eliza teaching him how to knead bread properly, laughing when his first attempts produced misshapen lumps that looked more like rocks than loaves. It was a small sound, that laugh, but it changed something in the cabin, made it feel less like a place where people were just surviving and more like a place where people might actually live. That afternoon, while Emma slept and Eliza rested in her room, Caleb rode out to check the fence lines on the north pasture. The snow was still deep, his horse struggling through drifts that came up past its knees, but the sky was clear and cold and the sun was bright enough to make him squint. He'd neglected the ranch badly over the past few weeks. He could see it in the sagging fence posts, the gate that hung crooked on its hinges, the general air of disrepair that accumulated when no one was paying attention. It would take weeks of work to set everything right again. Maybe months. But for the first time since Sarah died, he felt capable of doing that work. Like he had a reason to care about fence posts and gates, and whether the cattle had enough feed to make it through the winter. Emma needed him to keep the ranch running. And Eliza? Well, Eliza needed somewhere to be. Somewhere that wasn't whatever she'd been running from when she'd shown up on his doorstep. He fixed what he could that day, his hands clumsy in heavy gloves, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. When he rode back as the sun was setting, he found Eliza on the porch, Emma bundled in her arms, both of them watching the horizon turn gold and pink and purple. "She likes the sunset," Eliza said without turning around. "Gets quiet when she sees the colors." Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. He climbed the steps and stood beside them, looking at his daughter's face. Emma's eyes were wide, fixed on the sky, her small mouth working in the way babies do when they're processing something new. "Sarah loves sunsets," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, and for a moment he tensed, waiting for the grief to crash over him the way it had every other time he'd spoken her name. But it didn't. Not this time. "Tell me about her," Eliza said softly. So he did. Standing on the porch in the fading light, with his daughter in a stranger's arms and the cold seeping through his coat, Caleb talked about Sarah. About how they'd met at a church social when he was 20 and she was 18, both of them awkward and uncertain and trying to figure out how to dance without stepping on each other's feet. About how she'd been the one to propose, actually, after 3 years of courtship that was going nowhere because Caleb was too scared to risk rejection. About how she'd made the cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between workdays. "She wanted 6 children," he said, his voice rough. "Used to talk about filling this place with noise and chaos. Said she'd grown up in a quiet house and hated it, wanted something different for her own kids." He looked down at Emma. Guess she'll have to settle for one. She'd be proud of you, Eliza said, for keeping Emma alive, for not giving up. I was about to. The night you came, I'd given up. I was just waiting for it to be over. But you didn't. You opened the door. That counts for something. They stayed there until the last light drained from the sky and the cold drove them inside. Eliza fed Emma again, then put her down in the cradle, and Caleb made dinner, venison stew from meat he'd hung in the cold cellar, thick and heavy, and exactly what his body needed after a day working in the snow. They ate at the table, the fire crackling behind them, Emma sleeping peacefully nearby. It felt almost domestic, almost normal, like they were a family instead of two strangers thrown together by circumstance and desperation. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. Eliza looked up from her bowl. "Sure." "Where were you going when you got lost in the storm?" Her expression shuddered, the openness disappearing behind a wall of careful neutrality. "West," she said. "Just west." "That's not much of an answer." "Well, it's the only one I have." She set down her spoon, her hands folding in her lap. "I've been traveling for 3 months, ever since Grace died. I couldn't stay where I was. Every street, every building, everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I left. Bought a ticket on the stage and just kept going." "You got family out west?" "No, I've got nobody." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. "My parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week. Grace's father was all I had, and when he left," she shrugged, "I figured west was as good a direction as any." Caleb thought about that, about being completely alone in the world, with no anchor, no place that felt like home. He'd lost his father, and his mother had abandoned him, but he'd always had the ranch, the land, something solid to hold on to when everything else fell apart. "You could stay here," he said. The words surprised him, but once they were out, he didn't want to take them back. "Not just until the road's clear. I mean, really stay. Emma needs you, and I could use the help with the ranch, and I can't." Eliza cut him off, her voice tight. "That's not... I can't just move into your life like this. People would talk. They'd say things. About me, about you, about what it means that I'm here." "Let them talk." "You don't understand." She stood abruptly, moving to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'm not respectable, Caleb. I had a baby without being married. In the towns I've passed through, people look at women like me like we're diseased, like we're dangerous. If I stay here, if people find out, they'll say terrible things. About both of us. I don't care what people say." "You should." She turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "You have a daughter to think about. Emma deserves better than to grow up with people whispering about why her father's living with a woman who isn't his wife." Caleb stood too, facing her across the small cabin. "Emma deserves to grow up healthy and fed and loved. That's what she deserves. And right now, you're the only reason she's getting any of those things. Only because I happened to show up when you needed me. That doesn't mean... It means everything." His voice was fierce now, all the gratitude and fear and desperate hope of the past week boiling over. "You saved her life, Eliza. Do you understand that? My daughter would be dead if you hadn't knocked on that door, so I don't give a damn what anyone in town thinks about you being here. They don't get a vote." Eliza stared at him, her breath coming fast, tears streaming down her face. "I can't replace her," she whispered. "Your wife. I'm not trying to... I would never... I know that." Caleb took a step closer, gentling his voice. "Nobody's asking you to replace anyone. I'm just asking you to stay, to help me raise Emma, to be..." He fumbled for the right word. "To be family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them had intended, but both seemed to feel. Family. Not by blood or marriage or any conventional arrangement, but by choice, by necessity, by the simple fact that they needed each other and Emma needed them both. Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "Do what?" "Stay in one place. Let myself care. Every time I've tried to build something, it falls apart. My parents died. Grace died. Her father left. I'm scared that if I stay, if I let myself believe this could work, something terrible will happen again." "Something terrible might happen," Caleb admitted. "Or it might not. But running won't change that. All running does is guarantee you'll be alone when it does. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing it, the risk of staying against the certainty of leaving, the possibility of belonging against the safety of isolation. Finally, she nodded, just a small dip of her head, but it felt like a promise. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay, for now." It wasn't a permanent commitment, wasn't even close, but it was enough. That night, Caleb lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He still missed Sarah, would always miss her, but the grief didn't feel quite so crushing anymore. It had made room for something else, something that felt almost like hope. In the spare room, Eliza fed Emma one last time before they both slept. She held the baby close, breathing in the sweet smell of her, letting herself feel the connection she'd been afraid to acknowledge. She'd told Caleb she would stay for now, but sitting there in the darkness with Emma in her arms, she knew she was lying to herself. She wasn't staying for now. She was staying because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to live for, and this tiny baby had given her a reason to keep breathing. The next week passed in a blur of small moments that somehow added up to something bigger. Caleb taught Eliza how to milk the cow, laughing when she squeaked in surprise the first time warm milk hit the bucket. Eliza taught Caleb how to properly change Emma's diaper without getting everything soaked. They argued over dinner, good-natured bickering about whether stew needed more salt or if the bread was done baking, and discovered they both liked their coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. Emma thrived. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her arms and legs growing plump and healthy. She started smiling, not the reflexive grimaces of a newborn, but real, responsive smiles that lit up her whole face. The first time she smiled at Caleb, he nearly cried. The first time she smiled at Eliza, she did cry. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, wiping her eyes. "I don't know why I'm being so foolish." "You're not foolish," Caleb said. He was standing at the stove, stirring oatmeal, trying to give her privacy for her emotions. "You're just human." 10 days after Eliza's arrival, the weather broke enough for Caleb to ride into Bitter Creek for supplies. He'd been putting it off, knowing he couldn't avoid it forever, but dreading the inevitable questions about who the woman was that he'd taken in during the storm. "I won't be long," he told Eliza as he saddled his horse. "Few hours at most. Will you be all right?" "We'll be fine." She stood on the porch with Emma bundled against her chest, both of them watching him prepare to leave. "Take your time. Get everything you need." He rode out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, the snow glittering like diamonds in the morning sun. The road was rough, drifted in places, but passable. Other travelers had been through recently, wagon ruts frozen into the surface, hoofprints marking the path. Bitter Creek was small even by frontier standards. One main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a livery, and about 24 houses scattered around the edges. Caleb had lived within 20 miles of it his whole life, had gone to school in the church basement, had bought his first horse from the livery owner when he was 14. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him, which meant everyone knew about Sarah. The moment he walked into the general store, the conversation stopped. Every head turned, and he could feel their eyes on him, measuring, judging, trying to figure out if he was holding up all right or falling apart. "Caleb," Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the store with her husband, came around the counter with the kind of determined kindness that made him want to flee. "How are you managing? We've been so worried." "I'm fine, Mrs. Fletcher, just need some supplies." Of course, she patted his arm. "And the baby? How's the little one doing?" "She's good, getting stronger every day." "Oh, thank heavens." Mrs. Fletcher pressed her hand to her chest. "We were so concerned when we heard about the difficulties. Mrs. Brennan said the poor thing wasn't taking to the bottle, but you figured it out?" Caleb hesitated, knowing whatever he said next would be all over town by evening. "I got some help," he said carefully. "Help? What kind of help?" "A woman came through during the storm. She's been staying at the ranch, helping with Emma." The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Fletcher's smile froze in place, and Caleb heard whispers starting up behind him. "A woman?" Mrs. Fletcher's voice was carefully neutral. "What woman?" "Her name's Eliza Moore. She was traveling west, got caught in the blizzard, Ended up at my place. And she's staying at your ranch? Alone with you? The judgment in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. She's helping care for Emma. My daughter would have died without her. I'm sure she's been very helpful. Mrs. Fletcher's smile was thin now, not reaching her eyes. But you must understand how it looks, Caleb. A single man and a strange woman living together under one roof. No chaperone. She's nursing my daughter. The words came out flat and hard. Emma couldn't take cow's milk or goat's milk or anything else I tried. Eliza lost her own baby and still had milk. She saved Emma's life. That's all that matters. The whispers behind him got louder. He heard a woman's voice, sharp with disapproval. Shameful. That poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. Caleb turned around, ready to confront whoever had spoken, but Mrs. Fletcher grabbed his arm. Let me get your supplies, she said quickly. What do you need? He gave her the list, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed him as he moved through the store. By the time he'd loaded everything into his saddlebags and paid, his hands were shaking with suppressed anger. As he was leaving, he nearly ran into Pastor Warren on the front steps. Caleb. The pastor was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of earnest expression that made Caleb instantly wary. Good to see you. How are you holding up? Fine, Pastor. I heard about your situation with the woman who's staying at your ranch. Not a situation. Her name's Eliza, and she's helping with Emma. Of course, of course. Pastor Warren lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. But you must understand the position this puts you in. The appearance of impropriety. There's no impropriety. Caleb cut him off, his patience gone. She's in the spare room. I'm in mine. Emma's in the cradle between us. It's all perfectly respectable. I'm sure it is. But perception matters, Caleb. People talk. And if they start talking about you and this woman, it could damage your reputation, make it harder to do business, to let them talk. Caleb stepped past the pastor, heading for his horse. I've got a daughter to raise. That's all I care about. He rode out of town with his jaw clenched and anger simmering in his chest. He'd known there would be gossip, had expected it, even. But the speed with which judgment had descended, the automatic assumption that something inappropriate was happening, made him want to put his fist through something. By the time he reached the ranch, the anger had faded into something heavier. Worry, maybe. Or fear. Because what if the town's disapproval wasn't just talk? What if they decided Eliza wasn't fit to be around Emma? What if they tried to take his daughter away? He found Eliza in the kitchen, Emma asleep in her arms, humming softly. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded immediately. What happened? Nothing. He set the supplies on the counter, not meeting her eyes. Caleb, he sighed and turned to face her. People know you're here. They're talking about it. Saying what? What do you think? He heard the bitterness in his own voice and hated it. That it's inappropriate, that you're probably some kind of opportunist, that I'm a fool for taking you in. Eliza's face went pale. I should go. No. The word came out fiercer than he'd intended. No, you're not going anywhere. Let them talk. We're not doing anything wrong. It doesn't matter if we're not doing anything wrong. She stood, still cradling Emma, her voice tight. What matters is what people believe. And if they believe something bad about us, about you, they'll find a way to make it true. They'll come here, they'll ask questions, they can ask all the questions they want. The answer's the same. You're here because Emma needs you. End of story. You're being naive. Eliza's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've seen what happens when respectable people decide someone's not fit. They drove me out of my last town, you know. After Grace died and everyone found out she'd been born out of wedlock, they made it clear I wasn't welcome. The church ladies stopped speaking to me. The store wouldn't sell me food. Someone threw a rock through my window with a note calling me things I won't repeat. Caleb felt cold fury settle in his bones. That won't happen here. How can you be sure? Because I won't let it. He crossed the distance between them, standing close enough that he could see the fear in her eyes. This is my land, Eliza, my ranch, my home, and you're under my protection. Anyone who wants to hurt you has to go through me first. She stared at him, her breath hitching. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? Because you saved Emma. Because you deserve better than what those people did to you. Because he stopped, surprised by what he'd been about to say. Because I can't lose anyone else. Because you've made this place feel like a home again. Because when I look at you holding my daughter, something in me that I thought was dead starts to breathe. But he couldn't say any of that. It was too soon, too raw, too complicated. Because it's the right thing to do, he finished. Eliza looked down at Emma, and a tear slipped down her cheek. I don't want to bring trouble to you. Too late. You're already here. Might as well stay. She laughed, watery and small. You're stubborn, you know that? I've been told. That night, after Emma was fed and sleeping, they sat by the fire and made plans. If the town was going to talk, they'd give them as little to talk about as possible. Eliza would stay in the spare room with the door open. They'd never be alone in a way that could be considered improper. If anyone came to visit, they'd be nothing but respectful and appropriate. We're just two people helping each other survive, Caleb said. That's all they need to know. And if they don't believe it, then that's their problem, not ours. But even as he said it, Caleb felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down. He'd never cared much what people thought of him before. Had always been content to keep to himself, do his work, live his life without worrying about gossip or reputation. But now he had Emma to think about. And Emma would grow up in this town, would go to school here, would build her life here. If people believed her father was living in sin with a woman of loose morals, what would that mean for her future? He pushed the thought away and focused on the present. Emma was healthy. Eliza was safe. The ranch was holding together. That was enough to worry about for now. The future could take care of itself. In the spare room, Eliza lay awake long after the cabin went quiet, Emma sleeping beside her in the drawer bed. She'd told Caleb she would stay, but doubt gnawed at her. She'd seen how quickly communities could turn, how easily kindness could curdle into cruelty when people decided you didn't deserve their compassion. But when she looked at Emma, at this tiny, perfect person who depended on her for survival, she couldn't imagine leaving. So she'd stay, for as long as she could. And when the town finally came for her, when the judgment became too much and Caleb realized she was more trouble than she was worth, she'd leave without complaint. At least Emma would be strong enough by then to survive without her. That thought should have been comforting. Instead, it broke her heart. The weeks that followed Caleb's trip to town were marked by a tension that lived just beneath the surface of their daily routines, like ice over a river that looked solid but might crack at any moment. Eliza became quieter, more careful. She stopped humming while she worked. She kept the spare room door open even when she was changing clothes, angling herself behind the wardrobe for privacy. When Caleb came in from the barn, she made sure Emma was visible between them, a living barrier against accusation. She was trying to be invisible, Caleb realized, trying to give the gossips nothing to feed on. It made him angry in a way he couldn't quite articulate. You don't have to do that, he said one morning, watching her fold herself into the corner of the kitchen while he made coffee, as if taking up too much space might be considered presumptuous. Do what? Act like you're barely here. This is your home too. It's not, though. She said it gently, without accusation. It's your home. I'm just staying in it. That's not how it feels to me. She looked at him then, something sad and knowing in her eyes. Maybe not, but that's how it'll look to everyone else. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because she was right. No matter how innocent their arrangement was, no matter how necessary, the world would see what it wanted to see. A widower and a single woman living together. It didn't matter that they slept in separate rooms or that their only connection was the baby between them. Perception was reality, and perception was rarely kind. 2 weeks after his trip to town, the visitors started coming. The first was Mrs. Brennan, the midwife, arriving in her wagon with a basket of preserves and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Caleb saw her coming from the barn and walked up to meet her, dread settling in his stomach. Mrs. Brennan, what brings you out here? Just checking on the baby. She climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease. Making sure she's thriving. It's my job, after all. It was a reasonable excuse. Too reasonable. Caleb led her inside, where Eliza was feeding Emma by the fire. She looked up when they entered, and Caleb saw her shoulders tighten. This is Eliza Moore. he said, keeping his voice neutral. Eliza, this is Mrs. Brennan. She helped deliver Emma. Ma'am. Eliza nodded, not moving from her seat, Emma still nursing. Mrs. Brennan's gaze swept over the scene, taking in Eliza's simple dress, the tidy cabin, the baby feeding contentedly. Her expression was carefully blank, giving nothing away. May I examine her when she's finished? Of course. They waited in uncomfortable silence while Emma fed. The only sounds the crackling fire and the baby's soft nursing noises. When Emma finally pulled away, satisfied and drowsy, Eliza handed her to Mrs. Brennan with visible reluctance. The midwife examined Emma with professional thoroughness, checking her color, her weight, the way she moved her limbs, listening to her heart and breathing. Her expression gradually shifted from suspicion to surprise. She's doing remarkably well, Mrs. Brennan said finally. I won't lie to you, Mr. Ward. When I left here last month, I didn't think she'd survive the week. But this, she looked at Eliza. You've done something extraordinary. Eliza's face flushed. I just fed her, that's all. That's not all, and you know it. Mrs. Brennan handed Emma back to her. Keeping a newborn alive when her mother's gone, when she won't take anything but the breast, that takes more than just milk. It takes dedication, patience, love. The last word hung in the air, heavy with implication. I'm grateful to Miss Moore, Caleb said carefully. Emma wouldn't be here without her. Mrs. Brennan looked between them, and Caleb could see her trying to reconcile what she'd been told in town with what she was seeing here. Whatever judgment she'd arrived with seemed to be wavering. Well, she said finally, pulling on her gloves, I'm glad the baby's thriving. That's what matters most. She paused at the door. But Mr. Ward, you should know, people are talking, and while I can see there's nothing improper happening here, not everyone will be so easily convinced. You might want to think about that. After she left, Eliza sat very still, Emma sleeping in her arms, her face pale. It's starting, she said quietly. It's just talk. For now. 2 days later, Pastor Warren arrived, then Mrs. Fletcher from the general store. Then 3 women from the church auxiliary, claiming they'd come to bring food and check on Caleb, but spending most of their visit studying Eliza with barely concealed curiosity and disapproval. Each visitor left with the same uncertain expression, unable to find fault with what they saw, but unwilling to abandon their suspicions. The cabin was clean. Emma was healthy. Eliza and Caleb maintained a respectful distance. There was no evidence of impropriety, but that didn't stop the whispers. Caleb heard them every time he went to town. Fragments of conversation that stopped when he approached, knowing looks exchanged between shopkeepers, the way mothers pulled their children a little closer when he passed. The town had decided there was something wrong about his household, and no amount of propriety was going to change their minds. We should go, Eliza said one night, 3 weeks after the visitors started coming. They were sitting at the table after dinner, Emma asleep in her cradle, the dishes washed and the cabin quiet. Both of us. We could go west like I was planning. Find somewhere nobody knows us. Start fresh. Caleb looked at her like she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly. This is my home, Eliza, my land. I'm not running from gossip. It's not just gossip anymore. Don't you see? They're building a case, looking for reasons to say you're unfit, that Emma should be taken away and given to a proper family. Nobody's taking my daughter. They can if they decide you're raising her in an immoral environment. Her voice cracked with frustration. That's how it works, Caleb. I've seen it happen. A woman in my last town had her children taken because she was living with a man she wasn't married to. Didn't matter that he was her cousin. Didn't matter that it was completely innocent. The church decided it was improper and the law backed them up. Her children went to an orphanage and she never got them back. The fear in her voice was real and it chilled him. That won't happen here. You can't promise that. I can. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. This is Wyoming, not some eastern city. People out here understand necessity. They know what it takes to survive. Once they see that Emma's healthy and you're not going anywhere, they'll accept it. And if they don't? He didn't have an answer for that. The crisis came on a Tuesday in early February. Caleb had been in the barn repairing a broken stall door when he heard Emma crying. Not her normal hungry cry, but something sharper, more distressed. He dropped his tools and ran for the cabin, his heart pounding, images of disaster flooding his mind. He burst through the door to find Eliza pacing frantically, Emma screaming in her arms, both of them in tears. "What's wrong? What happened?" "I don't know." Eliza's voice was nearly hysterical. "She won't eat. She won't calm down. She just keeps crying. I think something's wrong with her. I think—" "Let me see." Caleb took Emma, feeling her forehead, checking her color. She was hot, too hot, and her cry had a quality to it that made his stomach drop. "She's burning up. I know, I've been trying to cool her down, but nothing's working and I don't know what to do. Go get Mrs. Brennan. Now. Take my horse. Ride hard. Don't stop." Eliza didn't argue. She grabbed her coat and was out the door in seconds, and Caleb heard hoofbeats a moment later as she rode out at a gallop. He spent the next 2 hours trying everything he could think of to bring Emma's fever down. Cool cloths, stripping away blankets, walking her, rocking her, singing to her. Nothing worked. She just kept crying, her small body rigid with discomfort, her face flushed and hot. By the time Eliza returned with Mrs. Brennan, Caleb was nearly as frantic as she'd been. The midwife examined Emma quickly, her face grave. "It's fever, probably from a cold that settled in her chest. Babies this young, they can't fight it off the way older children can." She looked at both of them. "The next 24 hours are critical. We need to keep her cool, keep her hydrated. If the fever breaks, she'll be fine. If it doesn't—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Mrs. Brennan stayed through the afternoon, showing them how to sponge Emma down with cool water, how to encourage her to nurse even when she didn't want to, how to watch for signs that she was getting worse. By evening, she had to leave, had another birth to attend on the other side of town, but she promised to come back the next morning. "Take turns," she said at the door. "Don't try to do this alone. You both need rest, or you'll be no good to her." After she left, Caleb and Eliza fell into an unspoken rotation. One would hold Emma and tend her while the other rested, switching every few hours. But neither of them slept. They just traded off exhaustion, kept vigil, and prayed to whatever might be listening that their baby would survive. The fever raged through the night. Emma's cries grew weaker, then stopped altogether, leaving only labored breathing that scared Caleb more than the screaming had. Eliza tried to nurse her repeatedly, but Emma barely had the strength to latch. They were losing her again, and this time there was no stranger at the door with a miracle cure. Just before dawn, when Caleb was holding Emma and Eliza was heating more water for the cloths, something in Eliza snapped. "This is my fault," she whispered. "What?" "This is my fault." Her voice was rising, hysteria creeping in at the edges. "Everything I touch dies, Caleb. My parents, Grace, and now Emma." "Stop it." He stood, still holding Emma, his voice sharp. "This is not your fault. Babies get sick. It happens. It's not because of anything you did or didn't do." "You don't understand." She was crying now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. "I'm cursed. I have to be. Why else would everyone I love be taken from me? First my parents, then Grace, and now Emma's dying too." "She's not dying." He said it with a conviction he didn't feel, because he had to. Because if he let himself believe Emma was dying, he'd fall apart completely. "She's fighting, and we're going to help her fight." "I can't lose another baby." Eliza's voice broke completely. "I can't do it again, Caleb. It'll kill me. If Emma dies, if I have to bury another child, then don't." He crossed the room and grabbed her arm with his free hand, forcing her to look at him. "Don't give up on her. Stay here. Fight with me. She needs both of us." Eliza stared at him, her face wet with tears, her whole body shaking. For a moment he thought she might bolt, might run out into the pre-dawn darkness rather than face the possibility of losing Emma. But then she took a shuddering breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They made it through to morning. By the time the sun rose, Emma's fever had dropped slightly, not much, but enough to give them hope. She took a little milk. Her breathing eased. Her color improved from flushed to just pink. Mrs. Brennan arrived mid-morning and examined Emma with careful thoroughness. When she looked up, there was relief in her eyes. "The fever's breaking. She's going to be all right." Caleb's knees went weak. He sat down hard in the nearest chair, and Eliza made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Keep doing what you're doing, Mrs. Brennan said. Plenty of fluids, keep her cool, watch for any changes. But I think the worst has passed. After the midwife left, Caleb and Eliza just stood there in the morning light, looking at each other over Emma's sleeping form, too exhausted and relieved to speak. We should rest, Eliza said finally. Yeah, but neither of them moved. They just stayed there, anchored by the baby between them, held together by shared terror and shared relief. That's when Caleb heard the sound of horses. He looked out the window and felt his stomach sink. 3 riders were approaching, men he recognized from town. Behind them came a wagon, and even from a distance he could see it contained more people. What is it? Eliza asked. Trouble. The riders reached the cabin and dismounted. Sheriff Tom Morrison, Pastor Warren, and James Fletcher, husband of the general store owner. The wagon pulled up behind them, carrying Mrs. Fletcher and 2 other churchwomen Caleb didn't know well. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his face apologetic but resolute. Caleb, we need to talk. About what? About your situation here, with Miss Moore. The sheriff glanced at the wagon, where the women were climbing down. Some folks in town are concerned about Emma's welfare, about whether this arrangement is appropriate for a child to be raised in. Caleb's blood went cold. Emma's fine. She's healthy and cared for, and we heard she's been sick, Mrs. Fletcher interrupted, pushing forward. Heard she's had a fever. That's concerning, Mr. Ward. A baby needs proper care, not whatever this is. She got a cold. Caleb's voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm. Babies get colds. Mrs. Brennan was just here. She said Emma's going to be fine. That's good to hear. Pastor Warren's voice was gentle but firm. But the illness isn't really the point, is it? The point is that you're living here with an unmarried woman, raising a child in an environment that many consider inappropriate. We've tried to be understanding, but what? Caleb cut him off. But you've decided I'm not fit to raise my own daughter? No one's saying that. Sheriff Morrison held up his hands placatingly. But people have concerns, Caleb, valid concerns, and we need to address them. Behind Caleb, the cabin door opened. Eliza stepped out, Emma wrapped in a blanket and held against her chest. Her face was pale but composed, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. I'll leave. Eliza, Caleb started. I'll leave, she repeated, louder. That's what this is about, isn't it? You want me gone so you can say the household is proper again. Fine. I'll pack my things and go. Just leave Emma with her father where she belongs. The visitors exchanged glances, and Caleb saw something in those glances that made his fury ignite. That's not enough, is it? He said quietly. You're not here to ask Eliza to leave. You're here to take Emma. The silence that followed confirmed it. Mr. Ward, Pastor Warren began, we believe it would be best if Emma were placed with a family who can provide. No. The word came out flat and hard. Absolutely not. Be reasonable, Mrs. Fletcher said. You're a single man. You can't care for an infant properly. It's not natural. Emma needs a mother. She has one, Caleb pointed at Eliza, who stood frozen on the porch. Eliza's been caring for her since she was born. She's kept her alive, kept her healthy, loved her like her own. You want to tell me that's not enough? That blood matters more than that? It's not about blood, Sheriff Morrison said. It's about propriety. About what's right. What's right? Caleb's voice was shaking now, with rage and fear in equal measure. I'll tell you what's right. My daughter was dying, starving to death in my arms because I couldn't feed her, and Eliza showed up and saved her life. She's given up everything, her own plans, her own future, to stay here and help me raise Emma, and you want to punish her for that. Punish Emma by taking her away from the only mother she's known? We're trying to help, Pastor Warren insisted. No, you're not. You're trying to make yourselves feel better about judging something you don't understand. Eliza moved then, descending the porch steps with Emma still in her arms. She walked past Caleb and stood facing the visitors, her chin raised. I know what I am, she said quietly. I know how it looks. A woman with a baby born outside marriage, living with a man who's not her husband. I know what you think of me. And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not respectable. Maybe I'm not fit to be around decent people. Eliza, stop. Caleb tried to interrupt, but she kept talking. But Emma doesn't know any of that. All she knows is that when she's hungry, I feed her. When she's scared, I hold her. When she's sick, I stay up all night making sure she keeps breathing. That's what a mother does. And if you take her away from me, you're not protecting her from scandal. You're taking away her mother." Mrs. Fletcher's face had gone red. "How dare you claim to be that child's mother? You have no right." "I have every right." Eliza's composure finally cracked. "I've earned it. Every feeding, every sleepless night, every moment I've chosen to stay when I could have left. That's what makes me her mother. Not biology, not marriage, choice, and love. And if you can't see that, then you're blind." The group fell silent. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. Pastor Warren looked troubled. Mrs. Fletcher looked furious. Then one of the women from the wagon spoke up, a younger woman Caleb didn't know. "She's right," the woman said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. "I'm sorry, but she's right." The woman stepped forward, addressing Mrs. Fletcher and the pastor. "I lost my own mother when I was 3. My father remarried 2 years later, and my stepmother raised me. She wasn't my mother by blood, but she was my mother in every way that mattered. And if someone had tried to take me away from her because they thought it was improper for her to be in our home," her voice broke, "that would have destroyed me, Mrs. Zinn." Fletcher opened her mouth to argue, but the younger woman wasn't finished. "Emma's healthy. She's cared for. And from what Mrs. Brennan says, she's thriving. Isn't that what matters? Not whether we approve of the arrangement, but whether the child is loved." Pastor Warren cleared his throat. That's a fair point, Susan." "Is it fair enough to leave Emma where she is?" Caleb asked. He kept his voice level with effort. "Or are you still planning to tear this family apart?" The visitors looked at each other. The silence stretched out, tense and fragile. Finally, Sheriff Morrison sighed. "I think we may have overreacted," he said slowly. "If Mrs. Brennan says the baby's healthy, and if there's no evidence of actual wrongdoing—" "There isn't," Caleb said firmly. "Then perhaps we should let things be, for now." The sheriff looked at Eliza. "But Miss Moore, you should understand that people will continue to talk. This situation—" "I understand," Eliza said. Her voice was steady again, but Caleb could see her hands shaking. "And I don't care. Let them talk. I'm not leaving Emma." The visitors left shortly after, their wagon disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust and uncertainty. Caleb and Eliza stood watching them go, Emma sleeping peacefully between them, oblivious to how close she'd come to being taken away. When the wagon was out of sight, Eliza's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, still clutching Emma, her whole body shaking with reaction. "I thought they were going to take her," she whispered. "I thought this was it, that they'd just take her and there'd be nothing we could do." Caleb sat down beside her. "They didn't, and they won't. I won't let them." "You can't promise that." "I just did." She looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes, not just for Emma, but for herself. Fear that she'd let herself care too much, that she'd allowed herself to believe this could last, that she'd been foolish enough to hope. "What if they come back?" she asked. "Then we'll deal with it." "What if next time the sheriff decides they're right? What if—" "Eliza." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the first time he'd deliberately touched her since the night she'd arrived. "We'll figure it out. Together. That's what families do." She stared at their hands, then up at his face, and something shifted in her expression. Understanding, maybe, or acceptance. "Together," she repeated softly. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, Emma sleeping between them, both of them too exhausted and shaken to move. The visitors would return, if not physically, then in the form of continued gossip and judgment. The town would keep watching, keep waiting for proof that their suspicions were justified. But for now, they were still together. Still a family, however unconventional. And that would have to be enough. Inside the cabin, Emma stirred and made a small sound. Not distressed, just the normal noises of a baby waking. Eliza lifted her up, and Emma's eyes opened, focusing on Eliza's face with the kind of recognition that only comes from weeks of constant care. She smiled. It was a real smile, wide and genuine and full of the simple joy that babies have when they see someone they love. Eliza burst into tears. "Hey," Caleb said gently. She's okay. We're all okay. I know. Eliza was laughing and crying at the same time. I know. She smiled at me like she knows me, like I'm hers. You are hers, and she's yours. Eliza held Emma close, rocking her gently, her tears falling onto the baby's blanket. And Caleb sat beside them, his hand still on Eliza's, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever judgments or threats or challenges, they would face it together. Because they weren't just two people trying to survive anymore. They were a family, and families didn't run. They stayed and fought. The days following the confrontation moved slowly, weighted with the awareness that they'd come dangerously close to losing everything. Caleb found himself watching the road more often, tensing at the sound of approaching horses, half expecting the sheriff to return with a different decision. But the road stayed empty except for the occasional traveler passing through, and gradually the knot in his chest began to loosen. Emma recovered fully from her fever within a week, her strength returning along with her appetite. She started staying awake for longer stretches, her eyes tracking Eliza around the cabin with unmistakable recognition. When Eliza spoke, Emma would turn toward her voice. When Eliza held her, Emma would nestle against her chest with the kind of contentment that spoke of deep security. Caleb watched these small moments and felt something shift inside him, a recognition that what had started as desperate necessity had become something else entirely. Eliza wasn't just helping him raise Emma. She was Emma's mother in every way that mattered, and the thought of losing her, of having to face another loss after Sarah, filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with something he wasn't quite ready to name. Late one afternoon, while Eliza was preparing dinner and Emma was napping in her cradle, Caleb came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway, arrested by the scene before him. The winter light was slanting through the window, catching dust motes in the air and turning everything golden. Eliza was humming something soft and wordless, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she rolled out dough for biscuits. She'd pinned her hair up, and tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She looked comfortable. She looked like she belonged. She looked like home. The realization hit him with unexpected force. Somewhere in the chaos of survival and fear and fighting to keep their fragile family together, he'd stopped seeing Eliza as a stranger doing him a favor. She'd become essential, woven into the fabric of his daily life so thoroughly that he couldn't imagine it without her. "You're staring," Eliza said, without looking up, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Caleb felt heat rise to his face. "Sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" He should have deflected, should have made some comment about work or weather or anything safe. Instead, he heard himself say, "About how different everything is now, how different you've made it." Eliza's hand stilled. She looked up at him, flour dusting her cheek, her expression careful. "Different good or different bad?" "Good." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. "Definitely good." Something flickered in her eyes, hope mixed with fear, the look of someone who'd been hurt too many times to trust easy words. "Caleb, I know what you're going to say." He moved into the cabin, closing the door behind him. "That you're just helping temporarily, that this isn't permanent, that you'll leave when Emma's old enough to manage without you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I don't want you to go. And I don't think Emma does either." "What are you asking me?" It was a fair question, and Caleb didn't have a simple answer. He wasn't sure what he was asking. He only knew that the thought of Eliza leaving, of the cabin emptying out again, of losing the warmth and life she'd brought into his world, it was unbearable. "I'm asking you to stay, really stay, not as a temporary arrangement or until Emma's weaned or until the town stops talking. Just stay. Be Emma's mother. Be part of this family." Eliza set down the rolling pin with trembling hands. "People already think we're living in sin," she said quietly. "If I stay permanently, if I never leave, let them think what they want. It's not that simple." She turned to face him fully, her voice thick with emotion. "You have a reputation to think about. Emma has a future to think about. If people believe her father is living with a woman of loose morals, it'll follow her. When she's old enough to go to school, to make friends, then marry me." The words escaped before Caleb had fully formed the thought, shocking them both into silence. Eliza's eyes went wide, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The cabin felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. "What?" she finally whispered. Caleb's heart was hammering against his ribs, but now that he'd said it, he couldn't take it back, didn't want to take it back. "Marry me," he repeated, steadier this time. "If the town's problem is that we're not married, then we'll get married. Problem solved." "That's not... You can't just..." Eliza pressed her hand to her forehead, visibly struggling. "Caleb, you don't marry someone to solve a gossip problem. Marriage is supposed to be about love, about family," he interrupted. "About choosing to build a life with someone. About committing to being there through the hard times and the good times. We're already doing all of that. The only difference would be making it official." "You don't love me." The statement hung between them, and Caleb realized with startling clarity that he didn't know if it was true. He'd loved Sarah, loved her deeply, completely, with the passionate certainty of young marriage. What he felt for Eliza was different, quieter, built on shared struggle rather than romance, grounded in respect and gratitude and a bone-deep appreciation for her strength. Was it love? He didn't know, but it was something real and worth protecting. "I care about you," he said carefully. "I trust you with the most important person in my life. I value your presence here more than I can put into words. Maybe that's not the same as being in love, but it's not nothing either." Eliza's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I can't marry you just to make things easier. I can't be a replacement for Sarah, a convenient solution to your problems." "That's not what you'd be." Caleb took a step closer, willing her to understand. "Sarah's gone. I'll always love her memory, but she's gone. And you're here. You've saved Emma's life. You've made this house feel like a home again. You've given me a reason to keep going when I was ready to give up. That's not a replacement. That's something entirely new." "I don't know." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. "I don't know if I can do this. Every time I've let myself hope for something permanent, it's been ripped away. My parents, Grace, her father walking out. I don't know if I can survive another loss." "Then don't lose this." Caleb closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "Don't run from it because you're scared. Stay. Marry me. Help me raise Emma. We'll figure out the rest as we go." "What if it doesn't work? What if we make each other miserable?" "Then we'll deal with it. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have given Emma a real family, a real home. Isn't that worth the risk?" Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Hope battling fear, the desire for belonging fighting against the terror of loss. Behind them, Emma made a small sound in her sleep, and they both turned to look at her. She was so tiny still, so vulnerable. She deserved parents who would fight for her, who would give her stability and security and love. She deserved a mother who wouldn't disappear, a father who wouldn't give up. She deserved what Caleb was offering, even if it was unconventional. "All right," Eliza whispered. Caleb's heart stopped. "All right? I'll marry you." She turned back to him, tears streaming down her face now. "Not because I think it'll fix everything, not because I'm trying to replace anyone, but because you're right. Emma deserves a real family. And maybe I deserve one too." The relief that flooded through Caleb was so intense it made him dizzy. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled Eliza into his arms, holding her close while she cried against his shoulder. She felt small and strong at the same time, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. "We'll make this work," he murmured into her hair. "I promise you, we'll make this work." She nodded against his chest, not speaking, just holding on. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the winter light faded and Emma slept peacefully nearby. It wasn't a romantic proposal. There had been no declarations of love, no promises of passion or devotion, but it was honest, real, built on something solid enough to withstand the storms that would inevitably come. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza's face was blotchy from crying, and Caleb suspected his own eyes were suspiciously bright. But they were both smiling, small, uncertain smiles that said they knew this was crazy, but were willing to try anyway. "We should probably tell people," Eliza said, wiping her eyes, "before we actually do it. Give them a chance to get used to the idea. Or we could just do it and tell them after. She laughed, watery but genuine. That seems like a terrible idea. Most of my ideas lately have been terrible. They've worked out all right so far. The wedding happened 3 weeks later on a cold March morning when the snow was finally starting to melt and the first hints of spring were creeping into the air. Caleb had ridden into town to speak with Pastor Warren, expecting resistance or judgment or lectures about proper courtship. Instead, the pastor had listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't conventional," Pastor Warren had said finally. "No, sir. And people will talk. They're already talking." The pastor had smiled at that, a small expression of understanding. "That's true enough. But you understand what you're committing to? Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, especially when the circumstances are unusual." "I understand." Eliza understands. "We're not expecting it to be easy, but we're willing to try." Pastor Warren had studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll perform the ceremony. But I want you both to come in for counseling first. Talk through expectations, responsibilities, what you're each bringing to this union. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." They'd had 3 counseling sessions, awkward conversations where they'd sat in the pastor's small office and discussed things like household responsibilities and child-rearing philosophies and how they'd handle disagreements. It had been uncomfortable, forcing them to articulate thoughts and feelings they'd been carefully avoiding. But it had also been necessary. By the time the wedding day arrived, they had a clear understanding of what they were building and why. The ceremony itself was simple. They held it in the small church with only a handful of witnesses. Mrs. Brennan, who'd become an unexpected ally after seeing Emma thrive under Eliza's care. Sheriff Morrison, who seemed relieved that the unconventional situation was being made respectable. And a few curious townspeople who wanted to see this strange union for themselves. Eliza wore a simple blue dress she'd made from fabric Caleb had bought at the general store. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried no flowers. Spring blooms were still weeks away. She looked nervous and beautiful and determined, her hand shaking slightly when Caleb took it at the altar. "You can still change your mind," he whispered while Pastor Warren prepared his Bible. "So can you," she whispered back. "Not a chance." The ceremony was brief. Pastor Warren spoke about commitment and partnership, about the sacred responsibility of raising children, about choosing to love even when it was difficult. Caleb and Eliza repeated their vows with voices that shook, but didn't falter. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Eliza's cheek, a chaste, respectful gesture that made her blush and the witnesses murmur. They signed the certificate in the church office, making it legal and binding. Caleb Ward and Eliza Moore, now Eliza Ward, joined in matrimony, a family made official by ink and paper and public declaration. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Emma slept in Eliza's arms, bundled against the March cold, while Caleb drove the wagon. The weight of what they'd done was settling over both of them. The reality that this wasn't temporary anymore, that they'd bound their lives together in a way that couldn't be easily undone. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked as they turned onto his property. "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. "Ask me in a year." "Fair enough." That night, after Emma was fed and sleeping, they stood in the main room of the cabin and faced the awkward reality of being married strangers. Eliza had moved her few belongings from the spare room to Caleb's room, their room now, but neither of them seemed ready to address what that meant. "I can sleep in the spare room," Caleb offered, "until you're comfortable with—" "No." Eliza cut him off, her cheeks pink. "We're married. People will expect us to share a room. And besides, Emma wakes up during the night. It doesn't make sense for one of us to be all the way across the cabin." "All right, but I don't you don't have to." "I know." She looked at him, and there was something like gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for understanding that." They settled into an arrangement that was equal parts practical and strange. They shared the room but gave each other space and privacy. Caleb would leave while Eliza dressed, and she'd do the same for him. At night, they'd lie on opposite sides of the bed with what felt like an ocean of distance between them, both carefully not touching, both hyper-aware of the other's presence. It was awkward and uncomfortable and nothing like what either of them had imagined marriage would be. But it worked. The weeks passed, and gradually they found a new rhythm. Caleb would wake first, start the coffee, then wake Eliza so she could feed Emma while he tended the livestock. They'd eat breakfast together, talking about the day's work or Emma's latest developments or the weather. During the day, they'd work separately, Caleb on ranch tasks, Eliza on household ones, but they'd come together for meals, and in the evenings, when they'd sit by the fire and take turns holding Emma, they learned each other's habits. Caleb discovered that Eliza sang when she was happy, soft melodies under her breath that filled the cabin with unexpected music. Eliza learned that Caleb needed quiet time after dealing with difficult ranch work, that he'd retreat into himself until he'd processed whatever was troubling him. They learned to read each other's moods, to know when to offer help and when to give space. And slowly, carefully, they learned to be comfortable with each other. One evening in late March, after Emma had fallen asleep and they were sitting by the fire, Eliza spoke into the comfortable silence. "Thank you." Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. "For what?" "For this, for giving me a home, a family, a purpose, for not giving up on me when the town wanted you to." "You don't have to thank me for that." "Yes, I do." She set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him directly. "I was ready to die when I showed up here. Not physically, maybe, but in every way that mattered. I'd lost everything, and I didn't see any reason to keep going. But then there was Emma, and she needed me, and you let me stay. You gave me a reason to keep living. That's not nothing." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "You gave me the same thing. When Sarah died, when Emma was dying, I was drowning. You saved us both. So we saved each other." "Yeah, I guess we did." Eliza smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger, lighter, like some of the grief she carried had finally started to ease. "That's not a bad foundation for a marriage." "No, it's not." They went back to their work, the fire crackling between them, Emma sleeping peacefully nearby. Outside, the last of the winter snow was melting, revealing the brown earth beneath. Spring was coming, new life, new growth, new beginnings. And inside the cabin, two people who'd been broken by loss were slowly learning how to be whole again. The challenge came 6 weeks after the wedding, on an afternoon when Caleb was out checking fence lines and Eliza was alone with Emma. She heard the horses first, multiple riders approaching fast. Her stomach dropped. She'd been expecting something like this, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the town's tolerance to run out. She picked up Emma and moved to the window, watching as 4 men rode up to the cabin. She recognized one of them immediately. Thomas Fletcher, James Fletcher's brother. A hard man with a cruel mouth and a reputation for violence when he'd been drinking. The other 3 were strangers, rough-looking men with the kind of eyes that made Eliza's skin crawl. They dismounted and spread out around the cabin, and Eliza's heart began to pound. This wasn't a social call. This was something else. Thomas Fletcher pounded on the door. "Open up, Mrs. Ward. We need to talk to your husband." Eliza held Emma tighter and didn't move. "I know you're in there. Your husband owes money, and we're here to collect." "Money?" Caleb hadn't mentioned owing anyone money. Eliza moved to the door but didn't open it. "My husband's not here. You'll have to come back another time." "That's not how this works." Thomas's voice was ugly with satisfaction. "He's got debts, overdue debts, and if he can't pay, we're authorized to seize property as collateral." "What debts? What are you talking about?" "Taxes on this land. 3 years overdue, plus interest and penalties, comes to nearly $800. Your husband's got until sundown tomorrow to pay, or this ranch becomes property of the county, and we get to take whatever we want as immediate collateral." Eliza's mind raced. $800 was a fortune. She had no idea if Caleb had that kind of money, no idea if this claim was even legitimate. But she knew one thing with certainty. These men weren't here to collect money. They were here to intimidate, to threaten, to take advantage of the fact that Caleb wasn't home. "I'll tell my husband when he returns," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Now please leave our property." "Or what?" Thomas laughed. "You'll make us? You're just a woman alone with a baby. What are you going to do?" Eliza looked around frantically. She knew where Caleb kept his rifle, on the rack above the door. But she'd have to open the door to reach it, and the moment she did, the men could force their way in. Emma started to cry, sensing her fear. "That's a pretty baby you got there," one of the other men called out. Be a shame if something happened to her. White-hot rage flooded through Eliza, burning away the fear. These men were threatening her daughter, and she would die before she let them harm Emma. She shifted Emma to one arm and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. She positioned herself by the door, ready to fight if they tried to break in. "Leave," she called out, her voice ringing with authority she didn't feel. "Leave now, or when my husband gets home, he'll make you regret ever coming here." "Big talk from a woman who's not even from around here," Thomas sneered. "Everyone knows what you are. Know you had a bastard baby and the father ran off. Know you latched on to Caleb Ward because you needed a man to take care of you. Well, guess what? He can't even take care of himself. So maybe you picked the wrong—" The shotgun blast cut him off mid-sentence. Eliza nearly dropped the poker in shock. She ran to the window and saw Caleb on horseback 50 yards out, his rifle raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He'd fired into the air, a warning shot, but his expression said the next one wouldn't be. "Get off my land!" Caleb's voice was cold and flat, carrying across the distance. "Now!" Thomas Fletcher's face had gone pale. "Now, Caleb, we're just here on official business." "Official business?" Caleb rode closer, the rifle still raised. "Official business doesn't involve 4 armed men threatening a woman and baby while her husband's away. That's called being a coward. You owe money. $800 in back taxes. I paid those taxes 2 years ago, got the receipt from the county clerk in Casper. So either you're lying or someone's trying to defraud me. Either way, you've got no business here." The men exchanged glances, and Eliza saw uncertainty creep into their expressions. They'd expected to intimidate an unprotected woman. They hadn't counted on Caleb returning early, hadn't counted on him being armed and angry. "We'll be back," Thomas said, trying to save face. "With the sheriff. We'll see what he has to say about this. You do that, and while you're at it, explain to him why you threatened my wife and daughter. I'm sure he'll be very interested." The men mounted their horses and rode off, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Caleb waited until they were out of sight before dismounting and running to the cabin. Eliza threw open the door and stumbled into his arms. Emma crushed between them, all 3 of them shaking with reaction. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" No, they said you owed money. Said they'd take the ranch. Said—" Her voice broke. "They threatened Emma, Caleb. They threatened our daughter." His arms tightened around her. "They're gone now. They won't be back." "How do you know?" "Because their claim is false. I paid those taxes in full. Someone's trying to run a scam, and they picked the wrong family to target." But even as he said it, Caleb felt cold dread settling in his gut. The men's arrival hadn't been random. Someone had sent them. Someone who knew he'd be away from the ranch, knew Eliza would be alone. Someone who wanted to scare them, or worse. And Caleb had a good idea who that someone was. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair with his rifle across his lap, watching the windows, listening to every sound that might signal someone approaching. Eliza had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep after hours of trying to calm her racing heart. Emma curled safely in her arms. Every time Caleb looked at them, the rage that had been simmering since he'd seen those men at his door threatened to boil over. They'd threatened his family, his wife, his daughter. That was a line no one crossed without consequences. As soon as dawn broke, Caleb saddled his horse and rode for town, his jaw set and his hands steady despite the fury coursing through his veins. He went straight to the sheriff's office and found Tom Morrison already at his desk, coffee steaming in front of him. "Caleb," the sheriff looked up, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you this early." 4 men came to my ranch yesterday while I was out, threatened my wife, threatened to take my property, said I owed $800 in back taxes." Caleb dropped the tax receipts on the desk, papers he'd retrieved from his strongbox that morning. "Those are paid in full, 2 years ago. So either someone made a mistake or someone's running a fraud scheme." Morrison picked up the receipts, his expression darkening as he read. "These are legitimate, stamped and signed by the county clerk." He looked up. "Who were these men?" "Thomas Fletcher and 3 others I didn't recognize. They knew I'd be away from the ranch, knew Eliza would be alone with Emma. That's not a coincidence, Tom." The sheriff's mouth thinned into a hard line. "No, It's not. He stood, reaching for his hat. I'll have a word with Thomas. Find out what this is about. I'm coming with you. Caleb, they threatened my family. I'm coming. Morrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but you let me do the talking. The last thing we need is this turning into a brawl in the middle of Main Street. They found Thomas Fletcher at his brother's store, leaning against the counter and talking to James in low tones that stopped the moment Caleb and the sheriff walked in. Thomas's face went carefully blank, but Caleb saw the flash of unease in his eyes. Thomas. Sheriff Morrison's voice was deceptively calm. Need to ask you about a visit you paid to the Ward Ranch yesterday. What about it? You told Mrs. Ward her husband owed $800 in back taxes. You threatened to seize property. You had 3 armed men with you. Morrison laid the receipts on the counter. Those taxes are paid in full, so I'm asking you, on what authority did you go out there making those claims? Thomas glanced at his brother, and something passed between them, a look that confirmed Caleb's suspicions. This had been planned, coordinated. We had information from a reliable source, Thomas said slowly. Someone who said the taxes were overdue. Who? Can't say. Source wanted to remain anonymous. That's convenient. Morrison leaned forward. Let me make something very clear, Thomas. If I find out you were part of a scheme to defraud the Wards, or if I get one more complaint about you threatening people on their own property, you'll be spending time in my jail. Understood? Thomas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Good. Now I suggest you find out who your reliable source was and tell them that kind of information should be verified before you go making threats, because next time I won't be so understanding. Outside the store, Caleb turned to the sheriff. That's not enough. It's all I can do without proof of fraud. Thomas can claim he was acting on bad information, and without knowing who gave him that information, James did. Caleb said it with certainty. Or someone he's working with. This wasn't about taxes, Tom. This was about intimidation. They wanted to scare Eliza, wanted to make us feel unsafe on our own land. Why would they do that? Because they don't approve of our marriage. Don't approve of Eliza being here. They want us gone, or at least they want her gone. Caleb felt the anger building again, hot and righteous. And I'm not going to let that happen. Morrison sighed heavily. Caleb, I understand you're angry, but you can't take the law into your own hands. If someone's targeting you, we handle it legally, through proper channels. And what do I do in the meantime? Wait for them to come back? Wait for them to actually hurt someone before you can act? You be careful, you watch your property, and you trust me to do my job. Morrison gripped Caleb's shoulder. I know this is hard, but starting a war with the Fletchers won't protect your family. It'll just make things worse. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to demand more action, more justice. But he could see in Morrison's face that the sheriff was doing what he could within the limits of his authority. Going further would mean crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. So Caleb rode home, his anger unresolved but contained, and found Eliza on the porch with Emma, both of them watching the road. What did the sheriff say? She asked as he dismounted. That he'd handle it, that we should be careful. That's all? That's all he can do without proof. Caleb climbed the steps and stood beside her, looking out at the land he'd worked his whole life to keep. But I meant what I said yesterday. Nobody's running us off our own property. Nobody's threatening our family and getting away with it. Eliza shifted Emma in her arms. What are we going to do? We're going to live our lives, work the ranch, raise our daughter, and if anyone comes at us again, we're going to be ready. The next week passed in tense watchfulness. Caleb hired 2 ranch hands from the neighboring property, young men who needed work and were willing to stay close to the house, providing an extra set of eyes and deterring anyone who might consider another visit. Eliza kept Emma close at all times, never venturing far from the cabin without Caleb nearby. They moved through their days like people waiting for a storm they could feel but not yet see. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Morrison arrived with news that made Caleb's blood run cold. There's a claim been filed against your property, Morrison said, standing in their main room with his hat in his hands. Not about taxes, about the land itself. Someone's saying your father never had clear title when he homesteaded, that there's a prior claim that supersedes yours. That's impossible. Caleb felt like he'd been punched. My father proved up on this land 30 years ago. The deed's been in our family since before I was born. I know, but the claim exists, and it's being pushed through territorial court. You'll need to appear and defend your title. Morrison looked genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry, Caleb. This feels like harassment more than legitimate legal action, but until it's resolved, there's nothing I can do. After the sheriff left, Caleb sat at the table with his head in his hands while Eliza moved around the cabin, too agitated to sit still. They're trying to take everything, she said, her voice shaking. First the taxes, now this. They won't stop until we're broken. We're not going to break. Caleb lifted his head, and his eyes were hard. I'll fight this claim. I'll go to Casper, dig up every document my father ever filed, prove this land is ours. And when I've done that, I'll find out who's behind this and make sure they understand what happens when you come after my family. What if that's not enough? What if it will be enough? He stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Eliza, look at me. We've survived everything else they've thrown at us. We'll survive this too. She wanted to believe him. She could see it in her eyes, the desperate need to trust that they could weather one more crisis. But she'd been knocked down too many times to believe in easy victories. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. But we're not running. We're staying right here, on our land, in our home, and we're fighting. The trip to Casper took 3 days. Caleb left Eliza with the ranch hands standing guard and rode hard, arriving at the territorial offices with a carpet bag full of every document related to his father's homestead claim. He spent hours in dusty filing rooms, tracking down records, copying dates and signatures, building a case that his title was legitimate and any challenge to it was baseless. What he found was worse than harassment. It was fraud. The claim against his property had been filed by a shell company with an address that didn't exist and signatures that looked forged. When Caleb dug deeper, following the paper trail through incorporation documents and legal filings, he found a name he recognized. James Fletcher. Not directly. Fletcher was too smart for that. But his brother-in-law's name appeared on the incorporation papers, and when Caleb tracked down that man's business partners, the web of connections led back to the Fletcher family interests. They'd created a fake land claim, pushed it through a corrupt or lazy clerk, and were hoping Caleb wouldn't have the resources to fight it. They'd underestimated him. Caleb took his evidence to a territorial judge, a stern-faced woman named Margaret Hastings, who'd built a reputation for not tolerating fraud in her courtroom. She listened to his presentation, examined his documents, and her expression grew progressively darker. This is egregious, she said finally. Not just the fraudulent claim, but the attempt to use the court system to harass a landowner. Mr. Ward, I'm dismissing this claim immediately and opening an investigation into who filed it and why. If your suspicions about the Fletcher family are correct, there will be consequences. I don't care about consequences for them, Caleb said. I just want them to leave my family alone. Judge Hastings looked at him over her spectacles. Sometimes the best way to ensure that is to make the consequences severe enough that they don't dare try again. Caleb rode home with the dismissal order in his saddlebag and a grim satisfaction in his chest. He'd won this round. But he knew the Fletchers wouldn't give up easily, and the fight was far from over. He was right. 2 days after he returned home, while he was working in the barn and Eliza was hanging laundry with Emma, sleeping in a basket nearby, 3 riders approached the ranch. Not the rough men from before, but townspeople, Mrs. Fletcher, Pastor Warren, and a woman Caleb didn't recognize. Eliza saw them coming and felt her stomach drop. She picked up Emma and started toward the barn to get Caleb, but Mrs. Fletcher called out before she could move. Mrs. Ward, please, we need to speak with you. Something in the woman's voice made Eliza pause. It wasn't the sharp judgment she'd heard before. It sounded almost uncertain. She walked toward them slowly. Emma held tight against her chest. Caleb emerged from the barn, alerted by the visitors, and came to stand beside her. What do you want? He asked, his voice flat. Pastor Warren dismounted, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. We came to apologize. The words hung in the air, so unexpected that neither Caleb nor Eliza knew how to respond. Judge Hastings sent word about what happened in Casper, the pastor continued, about the fraudulent land claim, and she made it very clear that certain people in this community have been engaging in harassment and intimidation. He looked directly at Mrs. Fletcher. We owe you both an apology for not stopping it sooner." Mrs. Fletcher's face was red, whether from shame or anger Eliza couldn't tell. "I didn't know James and Thomas were doing those things," she said stiffly. "I thought they were just concerned about propriety, about what was best for the child." "What's best for the child is having a mother who loves her and a father who protects her," Eliza said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not being torn apart by people who care more about appearances than about actual well-being." "I see that now." Mrs. Fletcher looked down at her hands. "I see a lot of things differently now. My husband has been arrested, Mrs. Ward, for fraud, and Thomas with him. They'll likely spend time in prison." She finally met Eliza's eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive them, or to forgive me for not seeing what they were doing. I'm just asking you to understand that not everyone in town supported their actions. Some of us were just blind." The third woman stepped forward then, the one Caleb didn't recognize. "My name is Susan Garrett," she said. "I was one of the churchwomen who came here to judge you, who thought what you were doing was wrong." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm the one who spoke up at that first visit, who said my stepmother raised me, and it didn't matter that we weren't blood, and I meant it, but I didn't do enough to stop the harassment. I should have spoken louder, fought harder, and I'm sorry." Emma stirred in Eliza's arms and made a small sound. Automatically, Eliza adjusted her hold, rocking gently, and the baby settled back to sleep. It was such a natural maternal gesture that even Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, "and she's lucky to have you." Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes. She'd been prepared for more judgment, more threats, more reasons to feel like she didn't belong. But this awkward, painful attempt at making amends, was something she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she managed. "The rest of the town has been talking," Susan said, "since the arrests, about how wrong we were to assume the worst, about how we drove you away from community when you needed support." She looked at Caleb. "We'd like to make that right, if you'll let us. There's a barn raising next month at the Morrison place. We'd be honored if you'd come. Bring your family. Let people see that you're part of this community, not separate from it." Caleb looked at Eliza, a silent question in his eyes. She could see he'd leave the decision to her. She was the one who'd been hurt most by the town's rejection, after all. She could refuse this olive branch and no one would blame her. But Emma made another small sound, and Eliza thought about what kind of world she wanted her daughter to grow up in. One defined by grudges and isolation, or one where people could make mistakes and learn from them, where forgiveness was possible even after deep hurt. "We'll come," she said. The relief on the visitors' faces was palpable. They talked for a few more minutes, awkward but genuine, before riding away with promises to spread the word that the Wards were welcome in Bitter Creek. After they left, Caleb turned to Eliza. "You sure about this?" "No, but I think it's the right thing to do, for Emma, if not for us." He pulled her close, careful not to squish the baby between them, and pressed his forehead to hers. "You're stronger than I am." "No, just tired of fighting." The barn raising was everything Eliza had feared and hoped for in equal measure. The entire town turned out, and while there were still some cool looks and whispered conversations, there were also genuine smiles and offers of help. Women brought food and included Eliza in their conversations about child rearing and recipes. Men worked alongside Caleb, treating him with the respect of an equal rather than the suspicion of an outcast. Emma was passed from arm to arm, cooed over and admired, welcomed into the community as naturally as if she'd been born into the most conventional family imaginable. And when someone asked about her mother's death and Eliza's role in saving the baby, the story was received with admiration rather than judgment. "You did what needed doing," one older woman said, her weathered face kind. "That's what mothers do, blood or not." By the time they rode home that evening, tired and dusty and sun-weary, something had shifted. The isolation that had pressed on them for months had lifted. They were still different, still unconventional, but they were no longer outcasts. They were neighbors, community members, a family. Spring turned into summer and the ranch flourished. Caleb hired more help, and with the extra hands he was able to expand the herd and repair the years of neglect. Eliza planted a garden that grew with astonishing vigor, providing vegetables for their table and extras to trade in town. Emma grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, cheerful baby who smiled at everyone and laughed at the slightest provocation. And slowly, carefully, Caleb and Eliza grew into their marriage. It wasn't dramatic or romantic. There were no grand declarations of love, no passionate encounters. But there was something deeper, a gradual intertwining of lives that happened in small moments, the way they learned to anticipate each other's needs, the way their hands would brush when passing Emma between them, lingering a little longer each time, the way they'd catch each other's eyes across the dinner table and smile at some shared understanding that needed no words. One night in late August, after Emma had been put to bed and they were sitting on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Eliza spoke into the comfortable silence. "I'm happy." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She sounded almost surprised herself. "I didn't think I could be. After Grace, after everything that happened, I didn't think I deserved to be happy again. But I am." "You've always deserved it," Caleb said quietly. "So have you." She reached over and took his hand, the gesture no longer careful or uncertain, but natural, easy. "Sarah would want you to be happy, you know. Would want Emma to grow up in a home full of joy instead of grief." Caleb's throat tightened. They didn't talk about Sarah often. The memory was still tender, still complicated by the fact that Eliza had stepped into a space Sarah's death had created. But when they did talk about her, it was with honesty and respect. "I think about her sometimes," he admitted. "Wonder what she'd think of all this, of you, of how Emma's growing up." "What do you think she'd think?" He considered the question seriously. Sarah had been kind, practical, focused on doing what needed doing rather than worrying about propriety. She'd have understood necessity, would have appreciated Eliza's strength. "I think she'd be grateful," he said finally, "that Emma has a mother who loves her, that I found someone to share this life with, that we didn't give up." Eliza nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I hope so." They sat in silence for a while longer, hands linked, watching the stars multiply overhead. Then Caleb said, "I love you." The word surprised them both. They'd been building to it for months, circling closer and closer to the truth, but neither had dared say it aloud. It felt too risky, too vulnerable, too much like tempting fate to destroy another good thing. But now it was out there, hanging in the warm summer air, impossible to take back. Eliza turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "You do?" "Yeah, I didn't mean to, didn't plan it. But somewhere along the way, it happened. You became more than just Emma's mother, or my partner, or the person who saved us. You became everything." She was crying now, not bothering to hide it. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so scared to say it, scared that if I admitted it, something terrible would happen. But I do. I love you so much, it terrifies me." Caleb stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her and holding her close. She buried her face in his chest, and he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. "Nothing terrible is going to happen," he said into her hair. "We've been through the worst already. We survived it. We're going to be okay. Promise?" "Promise." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they came together as husband and wife in more than name. It was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. Two people who'd been through fire learning to be gentle with each other's scars. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Eliza curled against his side and Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. A sense of rightness, of completion. This was his family, not the one he'd imagined when he married Sarah, but the one he'd fought for and built and earned through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, half asleep. "For what?" "For choosing me. For letting me stay. For making me part of this." Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for saving us." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and broken equipment, Emma's childhood illnesses and the normal struggles of raising a child. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership strengthened by everything they'd survived to get there. Emma grew into a bright, curious child who looked like Sarah but had Eliza's laugh and Caleb's stubbornness. She called Eliza Mama from the time she could talk, never knowing or caring that they didn't share blood. To her, Eliza was simply her mother, the person who fed her and held her and kissed her scraped knees and sang her to sleep. When Emma was 5, they told her the truth about how their family came to be. They explained about Sarah, about the storm, about Eliza appearing at exactly the right moment. Emma listened with wide eyes, then said, "So you were my guardian angel, Mama?" Eliza laughed through her tears. "I don't know about that, sweetheart. I think I was just someone who needed you as much as you needed me." That's even better, Emma decided, and went back to playing with her dolls. On Emma's 7th birthday, Caleb and Eliza stood on the porch watching their daughter play with friends from town. Children who'd been invited to a party complete with cake and games and laughter that filled the ranch with joy. The isolation and judgment of those early years felt like a distant memory, replaced by acceptance and belonging. "Look at her," Eliza said, her voice full of wonder. "Look at what she's become." "Look at what we've become," Caleb corrected, pulling her close. They watched as Emma ran past, her dark hair flying, her face alight with happiness. And Caleb thought about that terrible winter night 7 years ago, when he'd been standing in this same spot holding a dying baby and believing his world was ending. He'd been wrong. His world hadn't ended. It had transformed, been reborn into something he never could have imagined but wouldn't trade for anything. Later that afternoon, after the party had ended and Emma had fallen asleep exhausted from excitement, Caleb and Eliza walked to the fence line at the edge of their property. They'd planted a tree there the previous spring, a young cottonwood that was already growing strong, its leaves rustling in the breeze. "For Sarah," Eliza had said when they'd planted it. So Emma always has a place to remember where she came from. Now they stood beneath its growing branches, and Caleb pulled something from his pocket, a small tin box containing the last letter Sarah had written to him, penned in the days before Emma's birth. He'd kept it sealed all these years, unable to bear reading her final words. "I think I'm ready," he said quietly. Eliza took his hand. "You want me to stay? Or give you privacy?" "Stay." He opened the envelope with shaking fingers and read Sarah's words aloud, his voice breaking more than once. "My dearest Caleb, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're raising our daughter alone. I'm so sorry to leave you like this, but I need you to know something important. You're strong enough to do this. You're brave enough and kind enough and stubborn enough to give our baby everything she needs. Don't let grief consume you. Don't let fear stop you from living. Find help if you need it. Find joy when you can. And most importantly, find love again when you're ready. I want that for you. I want our daughter to grow up seeing that love is possible even after loss, that families can be built in unexpected ways, that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. Be happy, my love. Live fully, and tell our daughter every day how much her mother loved her. Sarah." Eliza was crying silently, and Caleb pulled her close, both of them standing beneath the tree, mourning what was lost and celebrating what had been found. "She knew," Eliza whispered. "Somehow she knew." "Maybe." Caleb folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. "Or maybe she just understood that life goes on, that we have to keep choosing love and hope, even when it seems impossible." They buried the box at the base of the tree, marking Sarah's memory with something living and growing. Then they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, their shadows stretching long in the golden afternoon light. Inside, Emma stirred and called out for her mama. Eliza went to her immediately, gathering their daughter into her arms and soothing her back to sleep with soft words and gentle touches. Caleb watched from the doorway, his heart full of a gratitude so profound it felt like prayer. They weren't bound by blood or obligation or convention. They were bound by choice, by the daily decision to stay, to love, to build something beautiful out of the broken pieces they'd been given. They were a family forged in a Wyoming winter, tested by judgment and threat and fear, and strengthened by the simple truth that sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with romance. Sometimes they begin with survival, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, survival becomes something more, something worth fighting for, something worth choosing every single day for the rest of your life. Years later, when Emma had children of her own and brought them to visit the ranch, She'd stand with them beneath the cottonwood tree and tell them the story about the storm and the stranger and the family that was built in the most unlikely way, about how her mother had saved her life twice, once by feeding her body, once by loving her soul, about how her father had taught her that family isn't about who shares your blood, but about who refuses to let you face the hard times alone. And her children would listen with wide eyes, and they'd understand that they came from people who knew what it meant to fight for each other, to choose love over fear, to build something lasting out of nothing but determination and hope and the stubborn refusal to give up. The ranch still stood, weathering storms and seasons, a testament to survival and transformation. The cabin still held warmth and laughter, filled with generations of a family that began with a knock on the door during a blizzard. And the tree still grew, its roots deep in Wyoming soil, its branches reaching toward sky, a living reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the most desperate moments. Sometimes survival is just the beginning, and sometimes the family you choose becomes the greatest gift you'll ever receive.